There's a moment in life when everything changes, just like that. 1 second your world is steady and predictable, the next it's turned upside down. For Mrs. Davison, that moment came with a phone call. An ordinary phone call on what started as an ordinary day. But by the time she hung up, her life would never be the same. You see, scams don't announce themselves. They don't come knocking with flashing lights or loud alarms. No, they slip in quietly, disguised as something familiar. A voice that sounds trustworthy, a story that tugs at your fears. And once they've got their hooks in you, it's almost impossible to break free. Mrs. Davison wasn't careless. She wasn't someone who fell for every trick in the book. She prided herself on being cautious. But here's the hard truth. Scammers don't care how careful you are. They study people. They know what makes us tick, what keeps us up at night, and they use it against us. This isn't just her story. It's a warning, a wake-up call. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. So settle in. Let me take you back to the day it all began. The day Mrs. Davison answered a call she'll never forget and lost something she can never get back. The call that changed everything. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the phone rang. Not too early, not too late, just ordinary enough to go unnoticed at first. Mrs. Davison was in her kitchen, sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper like she did most days. The house was calm, the kind of calm that makes you feel safe and settled. She didn't think twice about picking up the phone. Why would she?
Hello?
Her voice carried the warmth of someone who still answers calls with a sense of curiosity. The way people used to before caller ID made us all suspicious. On the other end, a man's voice greeted her. Calm, polite, professional. Mrs. Davison, he said, as if he'd known her for years. There was no hesitation, no awkward pause, just confidence. This is Michael from your bank's fraud prevention team. Her heart skipped. Not because anything felt wrong, but because hearing your bank's name tied to fraud has a way of grabbing your attention. He went on, explaining how they'd noticed unusual activity on her account. A large transfer attempt was flagged by their system. Nothing confirmed yet, but it needs immediate attention. Now here's the thing. None of this seemed out of place to her. Scammers are good at what they do. They mimic the tone, the language, and even the urgency of real professionals. This guy sounded exactly like someone who worked at her bank. He knew details too, enough to make it believable without raising suspicion. He asked her to confirm a few things. Her account number and the last 4 digits of her social security number. Nothing alarming there. Banks ask for that kind of information all the time, right? Then came the kicker. To protect your funds, we'll need to temporarily move them to a secure holding account while we investigate further. That phrase, secure holding account, sounded official. Who wouldn't want their money protected? So when he guided her step by step through transferring $50,000 to this so-called safe location, she followed along. After all, wasn't this what responsible people did? Didn't everyone trust the person on the other end of the line when they sounded so sure of themselves? The call lasted less than 15 minutes. By the end, Mrs. Davison hung up feeling relieved. Problem solved, or so she thought. But here's where the story takes its turn, because sometimes the worst part isn't realizing you've been tricked. It's realizing it too late. And for Mrs. Davison, that realization would hit hard and fast. So now you know how it started. But how did she figure out she'd been duped? That's where the real trouble begins. When the truth came crashing down. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Davison decided to double-check everything. She figured it wouldn't hurt to call her bank directly, just to make sure the transfer had gone through smoothly. After all, peace of mind was worth a quick phone call. So she dialed the number on the back of her debit card, the one she'd used countless times before. The customer service rep who answered sounded polite but confused.
"I'm sorry, Mom,"
he said after a pause.
"but I don't see any record of this secure holding account you mentioned."
Her stomach dropped.
What do you mean?
She asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray the unease creeping in.
A man from your fraud department called me earlier today. He said there was suspicious activity on my account and helped me move my funds to protect them.
There was silence on the other end, not out of rudeness, but because the rep was likely piecing together what had happened. Finally, he spoke again, his tone gentle but firm.
"Ma'am, I think you may have been the victim of a scam. Our fraud department would never ask you to transfer money like that. And we certainly don't use secure holding accounts."
The words hit her like a freight train. Victim, scam. Those weren't words she ever imagined applying to herself. She sat down heavily in her chair, the phone still pressed to her ear, as the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. She hung up soon after, her mind racing. $50,000 gone, just like that. The savings she'd worked so hard for, the nest egg meant to carry her through retirement, vanished into thin air. It wasn't just about the money, it was the violation of trust, the sheer audacity of someone preying on her like that. For hours, she replayed the conversation in her head, searching for clues she might have missed. How could she not have seen it? The signs were there, the rushed instructions, the vague explanations. But in the moment, none of it seemed unusual. She'd been too focused on solving the problem to question whether the problem itself was real. By evening, anger set in. Anger at the scammers, yes, but also at herself. Why hadn't she trusted her instincts? Why hadn't she waited, thought it over, or called the bank back immediately instead of following blindly? But underneath the anger was something deeper. Shame. Shame that she'd fallen for such a trick. Shame that she now had to tell her family what had happened. And then came the hardest part. The phone call to her son. Hearing his voice crack with disbelief when she told him broke her heart. He promised to help, of course, but that didn't change the fact that the damage was done. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the caller's voice, the numbers on her screen, the empty space where her savings used to be. The truth had crashed down on her like a tidal wave, leaving her drenched in regret and fear. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes, it forces you to rebuild stronger than before. For Mrs. Davison, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where pain turned into purpose and lessons learned became tools to protect others. What you need to know to stay safe. If Mrs. Davison's story teaches us anything, it's this. Knowledge is your best defense. Scammers thrive on confusion and fear, but when you know how they operate, you take away their power. Here's what you need to know to stay safe and make sure no one else in your life falls victim to these schemes. First, your bank will never ask you to transfer money. Ever. No legitimate institution, whether it's your bank, the IRS, or a utility company, will call, email, or text asking you to move funds to a secure account. If someone tells you otherwise, hang up immediately. Don't engage, don't argue, just end the call. Second, verify everything. If someone claims to be from your bank or another official organization, tell them you'll call back using the number listed on your statement or their official website, not a number they give you. Scammers can fake caller ID info, so even if the name looks legit, don't trust it until you double check. Third, watch for red flags. Does the caller sound rushed? Are they pressuring you to act immediately? Do they use phrases like, "Your account has been compromised," or "This is urgent"? Those are classic tactics designed to scare you into compliance. Real professionals won't push you to make snap decisions. Take a breath. Step away if you have to. Scammers hate delays because they rely on panic. Fourth, Guard your personal information. Never share sensitive details like your social security number, account numbers, or passwords over the phone unless you initiated the call and are 100% certain who you're speaking with. Even then, reputable organizations won't demand unnecessary info. Finally, trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Maybe the caller's tone seems too rehearsed or their story doesn't quite add up. Listen to that little voice inside telling you to stop and think. It's better to feel silly for being cautious than to lose everything because you ignored your instincts. These tips aren't just for you, they're for everyone you care about. Seniors may be targeted more often, but anyone can fall prey to these scams. Share what you've learned with friends, family, neighbors. Talk about it openly. Awareness spreads faster than deception. Because here's the truth, scammers count on silence. They depend on victims feeling too embarrassed or ashamed to speak up. But breaking that silence is how we fight back. And Mrs. Davison, she didn't let her experience defeat her. Instead, she turned it into a mission, a way to warn others before it was too late. So now that you know how to protect yourself, let's talk about the bigger picture. How do you turn pain into purpose? That's where Mrs. Davison's journey took its most inspiring turn. Turning pain into purpose, a lesson for everyone. Mrs. Davison could have let the shame and anger consume her, but she chose a different path, action. She started small, talking to friends, sharing her story at community centers, even handing out flyers with warning signs of scams. Her message was simple. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. Don't be afraid to ask questions or hang up. Word spread quickly. People listened, not just because of what happened to her, but because she spoke with honesty and urgency. Local news outlets picked up her story, amplifying her voice. Soon she became an advocate for senior safety, partnering with banks and law enforcement to educate others. Her pain didn't disappear, but it found a purpose. She turned a personal tragedy into a public service, proving that resilience isn't about avoiding loss. It's about rising after it. And that's the lesson here. When life knocks you down, you get to decide how you stand back up. For Mrs. Davison, standing meant speaking out. And in doing so, she ensured no one else would have to face what she did alone.